have the lights on and kind of a combination of our sage and magician of the ITC, would you please join me in welcoming Gary Morishima?
First of all, I think that recognize that Indian forests are among Indian country's most valuable resources. They provide tremendous amounts of income and provide fuel, non-timber forest products, sequester about 400 million tons. They also provide habitat, foods and medicine, opportunities, water, soils, and water and soils protection. But the health of natural resources in our forests and tribal communities are very closely intertwined. That tribal cultures and economies are intimately tied to place and land, and the healthy productive natural resources provide opportunities for employment in meaningful ways. It also provides important sources of fuels, medicines, water, and also foods. They also provide important resources for spiritual renewal. Recognized when NFIRMA was that the U.S. has responsibility for management of Indian forest lands. That existing federal laws do not sufficiently assure the adequate and necessary trust management of Indian forest lands, and that the federal investment in Indian forestry is significantly below the level of investment and management for lands for which the United States has no federal trust responsibility. That was the background behind NFIRMA. One of the things that NFIRMA does is it requires every 10 years an independent assessment of Indian forests and the status of those forests and our ability to manage those lands. 3 of these reports have been completed. So IFMATs 1, 2, and 3, the primary purpose that we gave to the IFMAT team was very simple. It was tell it like it is. Give us the good, the bad, and the ugly. We need to understand where we stand and what we need to be able to move forward. So the 3 magic? We'll see. Let me get to where I am in my PowerPoint here. All right. Well, the 3 independent assessments gave us some repeated themes. First of all, we've seen interdecadal changes in 8 mandated areas. Second, communities remains paramount. Thirdly, that Indian forests are potential models of sustainability. Then there's documentation of chronic problems that we faced in funding and staffing, and the need for an independent to avoid the pitcher-umpire scenario that John Gordon mentioned. So the 2 main recommendations that John summarized today from IFMAT 3, we're still facing a significant deficit in funding for tribal forestry and wildfire management. That's $100 million minimum. 39% increase is needed there. And also to increase professional and technical staffing levels by 792 positions and provide an additional $13 million for workforce development to give them the training and capacity skills that they're going to need. One of the things that's important to recognize is that IFMAT 3 tells us that there are some real costs to the failure to continue to invest. And the ITC did a quick calculation and found that there was over $1 billion lost in less than 40 years due to chronic failure to harvest the full annual allowable cut. That also meant that there were substantial losses in income and employment throughout many sectors of the tribal community. So the tribal communities are being affected in many ways by the failure to fully care for our forests. The bottom line of IFMAT 3 was that 2 decades after the IFMAT 1 report was done, that IFMAT 3 found that the federal government continues to inadequately fulfill its trust responsibilities. So the failure to provide these resources has very serious consequences, not only in terms of income and employment, but Indian forestry is at a tipping point, and that the chronic underfunding and staffing shortfalls have jeopardized the future of Indian forests and the communities that depend upon them. We're seeing increased threats of catastrophic loss from wildfire, insects, disease, drought, and climate change. All of these factors must be addressed proactively, and the economic and employment benefits that are badly needed in tribal communities are being lost, and some of the opportunities that are available are really not being pursued. These consequences are going to confront us for many generations. So it's just not what we're seeing today, but we're facing a future that the children in Indian country are going to have to contend with. Pervasive despair, hopelessness, persistent poverty, all of these things are going to take their tolls in Indian country unless we do something about it. But IFMAT 1, 2, and 3 do not just portray a vision of doom and gloom. The independent assessments find hopeful signs as well. First of all, that Indian forests are potential models for sustainability of the balance between the triple bottom line, the environment, the economy, and the community. They're also essential to maintain the health of our forests and communities. And in today's fiscal environment and challenges that we're facing with budgets, the ability to do more with less. The outstanding and continued dedication of Bureau and tribal staffs that are involved in forest management, and the innovation and creativity that's been formed. And one of the things that's happened as a result of underfunding and understaffing is that tribes have had to be more creative and innovative in terms of how they go about approaching their management. But can this progress and can this opportunity be sustained? It seems that trouble is everywhere. So from Groucho Marx, it says politics is the art of looking for trouble, finding it everywhere, diagnosing it incorrectly, and then applying the wrong remedies. The truth is that today the land, air, water, wildlife, and our forests are sick, and they're getting sicker. The climate change impacts portend things even worse. Intense storms, sea level rise, floods, drought. We're looking at habitat changes for fish and wildlife species and catastrophic wildfires. But natural resources have always been essential to the cultures, lifeways, distinctiveness, identity, and economies of tribal communities. And natural resources are still abundant in Indian country, but they suffer from years of neglect and abuse, insensitive or coercive development, encroachment, expropriation, and lack of investment. So the question that IFMAT 3 really poses is, has a real problem been diagnosed? The current situation is that tribes still have limited ability to manage their resources, and that the trustee defines the contours of the trust, that the tribal sovereignty and management of natural resources has to occur within the confines that are determined by the federal courts, the Congress, and the administration, and that tribes often find themselves in the position of seeking permission to exercise their powers of governance and resource management. So the current situation, tribes are kept in a perpetual cycle of dependence, and their capacity to become self-reliant is cut short by the lack of authority over their lands and resources, federal rules and regulations, and the ability of the necessity of tribes to seek funding from outside sources. So tribes are land rich but dirt poor. The trust administration has kept tribes in a perpetual state of dependence, that the federal administration is getting costly and greatly diminishes the ability of tribes to take advantage of opportunities, both in terms of restrictions and the timeliness. And lastly, that the fiscal pressures that are confronting tribes are diminishing budgets, and expertise is all being lost. The current situation as well is that the federal administration of Indian forests is still fraught with conflicts of interest that affect trust administration for the tribal beneficiaries. and that any remedies that you might have for malfeasance or mismanagement are few, and they're diminishing under the rulings of the federal courts. Federal staffing and support are inadequate to provide expertise and appropriate assistance when needed. Funding is inadequate. The limited funding is too often being diverted to the Office of Special Trustee, protecting the federal government from further claims of financial liability for mismanagement. And the question that tribes need to begin asking is, why should they be forced to be subject to the costs of complying with burdensome administrative procedures when there is no accountability or recourse for breach of trust? The truth is that the displacement of tribes from Indian country has brought many changes, that the relationships between human societies and the land, changes in the notions of our ownership of property, changes in our economic structures, changes in the political and governance systems, and changes in the concepts of science, whether it's traditional science or Western science. Those changes are being applied and affecting the management. Where once Indian country, Indian tribes were free to roam the land and free to utilize those resources to meet their needs, only islands of Indianness remain. And here's a picture of the remaining Indian lands that are solely within tribal jurisdiction. But the ecological functions that are really essential to sustain tribal cultures and economies are no longer intact. So fragmentation is something that Indian country has to deal with, and that's an enormous challenge. One that results from complex land ownership and political jurisdictions, encroachment, competition, settlement, and development, conflict over limited resources, and increasing responsibilities with eroding funding bases. So the question really is here, how do we keep from falling off the landscape? How do we reassert Indian presence on the land? And tribal presence needs to be restored on the land. The tribal worldviews and wisdom will be vital to the future of our forests and all of humanity. But this can't happen. This won't happen unless tribes are in a position to substantively influence the formulation and implementation of the policies, programs, and actions that affect our natural resources. So why tribes? Tribes are, first of all, political sovereigns. They've got unique government-to-government relationships, authorities to establish standards and regulation of environmental quality. They're also, as political sovereigns, have certain rights to consultation on a government basis, and they also have unique legislative rights and authorities. Secondly, tribes have reserved rights and the U.S. has fiduciary responsibilities. Thirdly, tribes are resource managers and stewards. They've had a long history of successful management, including status of co-managers of shared resources. Tribes are also original peoples with intimate, intergenerational, holistic, and place-based understandings of interconnections between people and their environment. And lastly, tribes have fragmentation experience. They're islands of Indianness, recognizing that the ecological functions that are essential to sustain their economies and functions depend upon the ability of partnerships. The tribes have adequate experience in this, have outstanding experience and ability to pull programs together. So IFMAT 3 brought a couple new things to the table that IFMATs 1 and 2 did not. First of all is the production of volume 2 of IFMAT, and that's a 300-page volume. And I encourage all of you to take the time to look at that, because that provides a detailed technical understanding and technical basis for the recommendations of IFMAT. And that's extremely important because it's going to give you the ammunition and support to make the arguments that are going to be needed. Another thing that happened in IFMAT 3 is the introduction of a concept called FIT, which stands for FIRE, which is just a shorthand way of referring to threats to forest health and productivity, investment, the need to correct the deficiencies that we've been facing, and transformation. In 2010, the Bureau of Indian Affairs Forestry Program celebrated its 100th anniversary. And for 80 years, the Bureau dominated management of Indian forests, and it dominated with a single purpose of generating timber production and timber revenue. Since that time, that domination has begun to be transformed from one of partnership, and now the stage is set for tribes to assume a greater role in leadership. So it's time to open your eyes, and in so doing, to open some doors, that the doors to the future begin to open. If MAD 3 has managed to capture high-level attention within the administration and the Congress through hearings, we are seeing the ability to at least open the way to potential important changes in the way our forests are being managed. But what we're really looking forward to in the future is a new kind of relationship between Indian country, the administration, and the land. Here are a number of those things. I'm not going to go into those in a great deal of detail, but I think that the time is right, that we have within the last couple of years seen major changes in terms of recommendations coming forward from trust reform, from the Trust Reform Commission. ITC, as a result of IFMAD 3, sponsored a symposium at Seattle University on the future of trust administration. ITC is also involved in reviewing and developing a set of principles for administration of the trust and also legislation. So the time for transformation is right, and the opportunity for tribals, Indian country and tribal leadership to step forward is there. So I've given you a lot of stuff to ponder, that we need to replace our fragmented, pixelized window of the world with a landscape view and social and economic realities. And the stakes are really high. We know that healthy resources are essential for healthy tribal communities and economies. There is some urgency here. It's time to act, that we can't afford to wait much longer. Our resources are deteriorating. Our capacity to address the needs to improve their management is also diminishing. And we really cannot afford to wait much longer. So hopefully I've given you a little bit of food for thought on IFMAT 3 and give you something to chew on as we approach lunch. Thank you very much.